All right, let's start the second portion of our notes for this unit. And in this part, we're going to be learning some very important terminology, some vocabulary, I guess, that'll help us moving forward, not just this unit, but in the coming units. Some of the things we're going to talk about, we've kind of mentioned in class, or you might have heard in another science class previously, like junior high. So anyway, just stick with me if you've heard a little bit of it before, and hopefully it's going to sit with you. So we learned about Mendel in our previous notes, and Gregor Mendel, father of modern genetics, is what we call him. But the truth of it is, people didn't know what to do with his work. It kind of went against everything that people had been understanding about, traits in offspring. And even now, the study of genetics is ongoing. I'd be a liar if I told you that, yeah, we know everything there is to know about genetics. Absolutely not. In fact, there's some things that could be found out tomorrow that would have us scrounging around to change up our entire curriculum. So genetics is ever evolving. And the things that we're looking at today wasn't even thought of at the time of Gregor Mendel. But the principles that Mendel set forth and the things that he found out and discovered was used to come up with some of these theories of what we have now. And what we've seen to be proven true time and time again. I use that term theory on purpose because we're still studying genetics. We could find out things that might even, go against some of the things we already know. It's good science. It's science that's going to be ever changing, and it's probably going to continue to change through your lifetime. Anyway, all right, so a gene, and we've mentioned this before, a gene is a piece, a small portion of DNA that provides a set of instructions to a cell to make a certain protein. Okay, on each chromosome, and we've used this example before, on chromosomes, there's genes, little segments in there, little portions of DNA that we're going to learn more about later on that spell out a code. Okay, and that whole code tells cells what to do, what to make. Now, these certain proteins, once they're made, they give us certain traits. They give us physical characteristics. We give us internal things even that cause us to maybe look a certain way or function a particular way. Okay, these proteins are what make everything work the way they're supposed to or cause an offspring to look a certain way. So these genes are the little set of instructions that basically gives those characteristics to an organism. Most genes exist in many, many different forms. This is what we call alleles. Okay, we call them alleles. So it's, we studied, one thing about Mendel was he chose either or traits in the pea pods. Things were either going to have purple flowers or white flowers. They were either going to have green or yellow peas. All right. But in reality, most genes exist in many, many different forms. It's not just one way or another. That's what was so cool about his findings was that he picked out things that were either or. But the truth of it is, think about the size of your nose. Okay, it's not just like everybody as humans have two different sizes of nose. It's this tiny little nose or this big honking nose, right? There's different sizes. There's different shapes they take on. They're gonna have a little hook on our nose or it stick out a little bit further from our face. So the genes that cause the proteins to make that certain trait that gives us our nose exist in many different forms. And we call those different forms alleles. All right. So alleles is the different types of genes exist, or different types of forms that exist in that gene. Now you only have two alleles for each gene. Okay. You don't have all the different types of them. Okay. But that doesn't mean everything's just one way or another. We have two alleles because we get one from mom and one from dad. We've got our homologous pair of chromosomes right here, right? And right here. These two go together, right? We have one from mom and one from dad. So we have a gene for whatever it is we're talking about on each one of these chromosomes. However, we're going to see that only one of them shows itself, all right? You see these terms homozygous and heterozygous. Let's look at those a little closer. Homo means same, okay? Anytime you see the prefix homo, it means same. So that means you have two of the same alleles. Excuse me. So the allele or that variety that's going to be on the gene that you have one from mom and one from dad, if they're exactly the same, it's a homozygous pair of alleles, right? Or homozygous alleles. So right here, it looks like we're talking about wrinkled and round pea shapes. This would be an organism that has homozygous alleles for both of them having wrinkled P's. This could also be homozygous if it was rounded P's on both of them. Hetero means different. Okay, hetero means different. It means you have two different alleles or varieties that are not the same on your homologous pair of chromosomes. So we got one here that's for a wrinkled P and one here for a round P. Now, remember in Gregor Mendel's time, the leading scientists were saying if you had things that were mixed up from mom and dad, like a black squirrel and a white squirrel, we'd have a gray squirrel. Nope, that's not really how it works. Now, we will see later on there's things called polygenic traits where there's a real big variety of different alleles, different sets of what causes things to look a certain way. It's on many, many genes. But for our purposes, we mainly need to know homozygous and heterozygous. Homo means they're the same. You got the same thing on one from your mama, one from your daddy. Hetero means you got them different, okay? They're different alleles on that homologous pair. Genes influence the development of certain traits, right? We saw that just a second ago when it makes proteins. You hear the term genome, that refers to all the organism's genetic material. Later on, we'll learn about something called the Human Genome Project. And this was a decades-long scientific endeavor, I guess you could say, to map out the human genome. It's spelled out. Here are all the genes that make a human human, right? And actually kind of went through and classified. Here's a gene for this. Here's a gene for that. And we're still trying to figure out what some of them are for, but we categorized them. The human genome is all the organism's genetic material. All right, we'll be talking about that. You'll hear it in videos. So when we look at these two terms, genotype and phenotype, a genotype refers to the genetic makeup of a specific set of genes. Here's what I always say. Genotype is what's written on the genes itself, all right? So a genotype would be, like here's wrinkled and round. Genotype, you could say this organism, this pea plant, has heterozygous alleles for pea shape, okay? The genotype here is what's written on the genes. Ooh, this one has homozygous alleles because they have the same two alleles. So genotype's what's written on the gene. This is a very clear distinction, as we're going to see here in a little bit, all right? Especially as we go in our notes in the next portion where we have to classify things as genotype and phenotype. Genotype, what's written on the genes? Here's the thing. This means absolutely nothing in the physical viewing realm of things, all right? This is what's written on the genes. We can't see that. You and I can't research that. We can't find that out in class. We have to actually dissect the thing and look at its DNA. We have to tear it apart in order to understand the genotype. Thankfully, that's what a lot of leading researchers in genetics can do. And they can tell you exactly what's going on with the genotype or written on the gene. Phenotypes is the physical characteristics of an organism. It's what we can physically see about the organism, okay? We can see it has rounded P's. It has wrinkly P's. You got a tiny nose. Coach Hicks is amazingly beautiful, right? These things are physically seen. Don't laugh. Physically seen. Phenotype is what we can physically tell about an organism, okay? Now, don't get caught up in that. It has to be seen. It could be something internal. If you have something wrong with your heart, like a genetic abnormality, that's a phenotype because it's physically a characteristic, even though we can't see it, okay? I use that terminology just kind of loosely. Genotype, what's written on the genes, okay? We can't prove that without really diving into the genome of an organism. Phenotype, we can tell. We can know the physical characteristics that's going on, whether by seeing or observing or experiencing ourselves. So when we got these alleles, we're going to look at what's called dominant and recessive alleles. You think of the word dominant, sometimes, at least me, I think about, like a football team or something, or a basketball team dominating the other team, right? Or you could think about like an MMA fighter that just dominated that fight. I mean, they were bigger, they were faster, they were stronger, they were more powerful, they put up more points, whatever. They just completely mopped the floor with them. That's not what's going on here, okay? That is not what this means, all right? Go ahead and throw that out because too many people walk into genetics and thinking dominant means this is a better allele. This is a better variety of that gene. This is what we want. Not necessarily. We're going to see later on that sometimes dominant alleles is what's caused genetic abnormalities or genetic defects. It's on the dominant allele. Okay, so it's not better than, it's not bigger than, anything like that. Instead, dominant alleles is the one that's going to be expressed. It's going to be seen in an organism when two different alleles or heterozygous pairs are together. Or if two of the alleles are homozygous, they're the same and they're dominant, of course they're going to be seen. That's all that something's got to see. One from mom and one from dad, they're the same. But if they're different, a dominant allele simply means that's the one that's going to be expressed. Okay. When we write it in science, we use a capital letter. More on this in the next set of notes. A capital letter. Okay, just know that. Capital letter always means a dominant allele. A recessive allele is one that gets masked over. Okay, that's what I always think about. So if somebody has a dominant and a recessive allele, it's a heterozygous pair there, the recessive one's going to take a back seat. Okay, it's going to be covered up by the dominant. It's not going to be seen inside that organism. Okay, it's not going to be seen in their physical characteristics, but it's still there, right? Can't get rid of your genes once it's there. It's going to be present in the alleles, and it's potentially passed on to offspring because of like meiosis, how things break up into those sperm and egg cells, and you split up your DNA. So recessive is only going to be expressed if two copies of the recessive are present, right? So if it's and look at this will help clarify a little bit, hopefully. If both of them are expressed, we use a smaller case or lowercase letter to represent recessive, not because it's weaker, not because it's less than. It's just simply not going to be seen if a dominant is present. Okay. A homozygous dominant pair of alleles we express as big letter, big letter. Here we're just using T. Now the letter we use are arbitrary. We'll look at that more in our next set of notes. But big T means a homo, there's the same, they're going to be the same, homozygous dominant. Two big letters, right? So if we were to just say something is homozygous dominant, you can think we're going to write it or shorthand it as big letter, big letter. Let's just jump down to 5. Homozygous recessive, homo meaning same, recessive meaning that one that's going to take a back seat, is lowercase, lowercase. Here it's little t, right? All right. Homo being same, recessive, lowercase. Hetero, meaning different, means that the set of alleles has one dominant and one recessive. Okay, this is when it gets kind of interesting because these you can probably figure out. That's all that the organism has on there. It's alleles, right? It's definitely going to be it. Same way down here. In this one, however, the dominant one is the one that we're going to see. The organism itself carries one of its alleles that is recessive and could potentially pass that down to offspring. This is majorly important, 3, 4, and 5. Memorize this, learn it, go back over it that I've been talking about for the last minute and a half. So, when we look at these alleles and the phenotypes, what's physically made up, both homozygous dominant, so in the last one, big T, and heterozygous, big T, little t, genotypes are going to give us a dominant phenotype, meaning whatever that dominant trait is what we're going to see in that organism, okay? Of course, if it's homozygous recessive, meaning that it only has those recessive alleles, that's what's going to be seen in the phenotype, right? It's going to give us a recessive phenotype. Now, this is important. Now, in our science class, we have to kind of break things down to simple terms, but in reality, most traits occur in a range, just like I was talking about nose size. It's not as simple as dominant and recessive. Dominant, big noses are recessive, or dominant, big noses are dominant, little noses are recessive. It's not that easy. There's a range. But for our purposes, we're going to try to only look, just like Gregor Mendel, at either or characteristics. I want you to try to come back and think about these. What's the difference between a gene and an allele? A gene is the portion of the DNA that spells out something physically. An allele is the variety of the genes. Differences in genotype, phenotype. Genotype is what's written on the genes. Phenotype is what we physically can tell about an organism. Homozygous, same set of alleles. Heterozygous, two different alleles. How do you know an allele is dominant or recessive? By what case letter they use. Dominant is expressed by uppercase, recessive is expressed by lowercase.